With football season upon us now, there's a lot happening in the news, so be sure to subscribe to my other channel, JG9 News, where I give you up-to-the-minute updates on everything happening in the NFL in a completely relaxed, unscripted format, and I give my thoughts on everything taking place around the National Football League today. And now, on with our feature presentation. I want to give you this hypothetical scenario. This team right here is the Carolina Panthers, and if you're watching as of this video getting released, I think it's fair to say that no one expects them to be any good this year. In fact, I go as far as saying that people expect them to be quite bad, and to be one of the worst teams in the NFL. Now let's say that the season progresses, and somehow, the Panthers actually seem to be doing alright. They're a pleasant surprise that has caught a ton of people off guard, and with 5 games left in the season, they find themselves squarely in the playoff race. Are they a great team? Not by any means, and they've definitely had their fair share of downs. But in this hypothetical example, with 5 games to go, they find themselves just 1 game back of the lead in the NFC South, squarely in the division race to make it to the postseason. Now I want you to imagine that David Tepper, who I think we can all agree at this very moment in time is not a good owner, comes out before the Panthers are set to play their next game, and he says, "This team is not winning the division. I can't see us doing anything from this point on. I can't see this team making the playoffs at all." That'd be really stupid to say, right? That would be downright unbelievable for the owner of a team to say while his team is in the middle of the playoff race, and while they're playing good football, assuming no injuries, that they've got no chance at doing anything. It would kill morale. It would make you seem like you're almost rooting for the team to lose. It would destroy fan support, and it would do a whole bunch of other things that wouldn't even be the slightest bit positive. Bottom line, this would be a really bad idea. However, what's not a bad idea is hitting that like button down below, subscribing, and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that we post on the channel. We post every single day about the weird and wacky history of the NFL, so if you like that sort of stuff, then this is the place for you. So subscribe today and help us reach 70,000 subscribers, and thanks in advance for your support. Well, I bring that up because this team right here is the New Orleans Saints. And in 1973, let's just say that their owner, John Mecum Jr., decided to say something crazy while his team was in the middle of the season and still had a ton to play for. He said words that you never hear an owner dare to utter, and he said things that let the air come rushing out of the balloon that was the Saints' surprisingly good season thus far. And more than a half a century later, we're taking a deep dive into those comments today, and just how stupid it was considering all of the circumstances at play. Because more than 50 years later, this is the story behind one of the dumbest moments in the history of the New Orleans Saints franchise, and the time that the Saints owner just decided to give up for no reason. Before I talk about the absolutely dumb thing that the Saints owner said, thinking that it was a good idea for some reason, or just not thinking at all, we need some context to understand how the Saints were doing up until this point, and how their season was going. The year is 1973, and the Saints seemed like they were going to be the laughingstock of football for another year. 6 years into the franchise's history, and they had yet to make the playoffs or finish with a record of 500 or better, with their best finish being a 5-9 season in 1969. And they were coming off of an abysmal 1972 campaign where they went 2-11-1. Things did not seem like they were going to be good in 1973 by any stretch of the imagination, just based off of history and common sense. And to be fair to the Saints, they did not start off well at all. The preseason was such a disaster that head coach J.D. Roberts was fired and was replaced by John North. And yes, you heard that right. The Saints were playing so poorly in the preseason that the owner decided to switch coaches. That's something you won't see happen today. And then, when the Saints started off the games that mattered, they looked terrible. They lost 62-7 to the Atlanta Falcons in the opening week, then followed that up with a 40-3 loss to the Dallas Cowboys in Week 2, meaning that 2 weeks into the season, the Saints were outscored 102-10 in what has to be one of the worst opening 2-game stretches for any team ever. And then they followed that up with a loss to the Baltimore Colts, meaning that the Saints found themselves at 0-3 after 3 weeks, with no wins by the end of September and having already changed coaches. As you can tell from all those lowlights, yeah, they were off to about the worst start imaginable. However, something strange seemed to happen for this team behind me right here after that 0-3 start. Something bizarre happened that would completely turn the tide around. Because despite starting 0-3 and despite looking like the laughingstock of the NFL, after September ended, the Saints actually began to win some games. New Orleans would win 21-16 against the Chicago Bears, in a game that you can learn more about by clicking the card in the upper right corner. They would follow that up with a 20-13 win against the Detroit Lions, then 2 weeks later, would follow that up by defeating the defending NFC champion by beating Washington 19-3, and then would follow that up by shutting out the Buffalo Bills by a final score of 13-0, recording the team's first shutout in franchise history. Everything started off like an absolute disaster for the Saints, and yet, 8 weeks into the 14-week season, they were somehow sitting at 500, sitting pretty with a 4-4 record, all while beating some fairly solid teams in the process. This 500 record shocked a ton of people. To give you some perspective on how crazy the start of the season was for the Saints considering their prior history, especially seeing as they started 0-3, this was, quite literally, the first time in Saints history that they were 500 or better 8 weeks into the year. There was a real sense of hope and belief surrounding this team right here, and it's not hard to see why when you've won 4 of your last 5, and when you seem to be turning the corner with a new head coach in charge. Because 8 weeks into the year, and despite that 0-3 start, the Saints had done enough to get themselves squarely back in the playoff hunt. Here's a look at the standings 8 weeks into the 1973 season on the NFC side. Back in 1973, 4 teams in each conference made it into the playoffs, with the 3 division winners advancing, plus the top remaining team, otherwise known as the wild card. And you can see that with 6 games to go in the season, the Saints were, dare I say it, one of the favorites to get a playoff spot. They were 2 games back of the Los Angeles Rams for the lead in the NFC West, but the Saints still had to play the Rams twice, so the Saints controlled their own destiny for the division lead. And even if they couldn't quite get the division lead, at 4-4, they were just 1 game back of Washington and Atlanta for the lone wildcard spot in the conference, with the Saints still having to play Atlanta one more time, and with the Saints owning the head-to-head tiebreaker over Washington by virtue of their Week 7 upset win. The Saints had 6 games left in the season, and 3 of them were against some of the worst teams in football, with a game against the 1-6-1 Chargers, a game against the 2-4-2 Packers, and a game against the 3-5 49ers on the docket. This is all to say that the Saints were very much in this. By no means was it a stretch after 8 weeks to say that the New Orleans Saints could win the NFC West for the first time ever, or to say that the New Orleans Saints could make the playoffs for the first time ever. However, it was a stretch to one man, and one man in particular. That man? Well, that was none other than the owner of the Saints himself, John Mecum Jr., who had some, shall we say, interesting things to say about his team. Because right as the Saints were getting ready to take on the Los Angeles Rams, in arguably their biggest game in franchise history up until that point, and right as the Saints were getting ready to try and get above 500 after 9 weeks for the first time ever, Mecum decided to come in and ruin the party. He decided to be a Debbie Downer. Because for some bizarre reason, Mecum thought it was a good idea to publicly say that his team wasn't going to do anything. This run that they're on right now? Total fluke. The fact that they're in the playoff hunt? It's not going to last. The fact that they're playing some good football? Don't buy it for a second. Because as Mecum said for some strange reason, we're not a Super Bowl contender. We'd like to be a division contender, but maybe that's a little overly optimistic too. You heard that right, folks. You heard that right. The owner of the Saints thinks that his team won't be successful. Now look, There's ways that you can go about this with some tact. And there's ways that you can go about this while not sounding delusional. You could easily say something like, there's still a lot of work left to do in the season, and anything can happen. No issues with that. You could say something like, our team is in the hunt right now, but the job's not even close to done, and there's a lot of time remaining. And I'd have no issues with that. Heck, you could say something like, our team is playing well, but there's a long way to go before we can even start thinking about the P word and a championship. All of those responses would have been perfectly acceptable and would have sufficed for me. It would have been a complete non-story. It would have been just generic talk. But to say this, to say those words, to say that your team can't win the Super Bowl and can't win the division when they literally control their own destiny in doing so? Why the heck would you say that? It'd be one thing if that was said when it was mathematically impossible or just about impossible to accomplish such a thing. If you said those words and the Saints were 2-6 at that point, alright, I'm not going to beat you up over that, because you would need a solid 7 meteor strikes to even have a shot at the postseason. But not here! Like, dude, you're only a game back of the wild card! You literally control your own destiny in the division race! If you beat the Rams, you could be one game out of the lead with the tiebreaker, and you still have 3 games to go against crap teams. If you beat the Rams, you can literally be the wild card with 5 games to go, depending on how other results around the league regarding Washington and Atlanta go. It's not some far-fetched possibility where you need a gajillion completely unrealistic things to happen, or it goes down to the 270th tiebreaker and everything has to bounce your way. Like, you're a game out! You're a freaking game out! Your team is playing good football! You keep this up, and you'll be in the playoffs! No questions asked! And you're out here before the biggest game of the season, and the biggest game in franchise history, and you're out here saying this crap? You're out here saying, yeah, we're not winning the Super Bowl, and we're not contending for the division. You're out here saying to not expect anything from this team at all? How is that a good idea? How is that going to pump up the fans and convince them to believe in you guys and go to the games and buy the merchandise and support the team when you don't even believe in yourself? How is that going to pump up the players when their boss is publicly expressing doubt that this can be done? How is this beneficial to quite literally anyone involved? Is there any positive from this statement for any party? I don't think there is. Truly, in terms of the net gain from a statement like this, when it comes to any party, this is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard an owner say. And trust me, I've heard a lot. There was no reason for any comment like this to be made, and we clearly saw why here. Now, when it came to what happened afterwards for this team behind me right here, unfortunately, John Mecum Jr. was 100% right. The Saints would lose their Week 9 matchup against the Los Angeles Rams by a score of 29-7, and would end the season losing 5 of their final 6 games, finishing the year with a 5-9 record, well off the division lead, and obviously nowhere close to being a Super Bowl contender. It was another season below 500 for New Orleans, which would be a pretty common theme for them throughout the 1970s and the first half of the 1980s. So yes, John Mecum Jr. was 100% right. But there's a time and a place for everything, especially when you're the owner of the team. And maybe, just maybe, it was not a good idea to say those remarks. Just some food for thought. So what's the moral of the story here? If you're an NFL owner and your team is in the playoff race with a realistic shot at making it and possibly winning the division or getting a wild card, then think about what John Mecum Jr. did on this day in 1973 prior to the game against the Rams. And then do literally the exact opposite. Do not talk to people about how the team can't compete. Do not talk to people about how the team is not a contender. Do not talk to people about how this will probably amount to nothing and the light is approaching at the end of the tunnel. Just do not say that at all. Do not say that to the press. Just keep your mouth shut. Even if Mecum turned out to be right, it was a horrible idea to say it 50 some odd years ago, and it remains a horrible idea to this day. If your team is within a game of the playoffs, the last thing you should say is, "We have no chance at contending for the playoffs." Because when it came to the good times rolling in 1973, owner John Mecum Jr. made it clear to anyone watching and to anyone listening that the Saints would not go marching into the playoffs anytime soon. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jj9shop.com, and be sure to like and subscribe, as it really helps the channel out a lot. Join me every Wednesday night where we'll play NFL Trivia for cash prizes at 9 p.m. Eastern over on Twitch. To learn more about the history of college football, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 8. To learn more about the history of Major League Baseball, subscribe to Jaguar Gator 7. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping out the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.